Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mei Wei, the Dean of the Russ College of Engineering and Technology. I'm very excited to welcome you to this Stocker lecture celebrating the National Academy of Engineering's Russ Prize and featuring Dr. Richard Schatz, one of the 2019 recipients. The NAE and Ohio University recognized Dr. Schatz and 4 others early last year for innovations in coronary angioplasty, enabling the minimally invasive treatment of heart disease. We have been lucky to host the other 4 recipients over the past 4 and also early this week. So in case today is your first Russ Prize lecture, the Russ Prize is currently the top bioengineering prize in the world, which is comparable to the Nobel Prize. So you may not know this, but there is no Nobel Prize for engineering. Russ College alumnus Fritz Russ, who was an innovator in biomedical engineering himself, and his wife Doris established the Russ Prize with a gift to Ohio University. So their goal was to recognize achievement that improve the human conditions. So awarded every other year since 2001. The prize has honored accomplishments including kidney dialysis, the automated DNA sequencer, and the technology behind LASIK surgery and the cochlear implant. So we are very, very proud to celebrate the engineers, scientists, and physicians who we call creators for good. Behind these technologies, they have saved and improved millions of lives. So now I'm very happy to introduce our guest today. Dr. Schatz is Research Director of Cardiovascular Interventions at the Scripps Heart, Lung, and Vascular Center, and is also Director of Gene and Stem Cell Therapy. A recognized international expert in interventional cardiology, he also published and lectured extensively. His work in coronary stents spurred a revolution in the treatment of coronary artery disease. More than 2 million of them are placed annually worldwide. He collaborated with fellow 2019 Russ Prize recipient Dr. Palmas to pioneer the field of vascular stents. In 1994, the FDA approved the Palmas-Schatz stent. Nearly 100 million patients have been treated with it worldwide, making the Palmas-Schatz stent one of the top 10 medical device patents of the last 50 years. So today, I believe he will tell you more story about this invention. So Dr. Schatz attended the State University of New York at Buffalo and earned his medical degree from Duke Medical School. Duke University awarded him with both the Distinguished Alumnus Award and Lifetime Scholar Award. He is also a distinguished fellow of the Hong Kong Cardiology Society, as well as an elected fellow of the American College of Cardiology. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Schatz to Ohio University.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you for the warm introduction. Can you hear me okay? All right. So it was a real honor and pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. My schedule didn't permit me to come any sooner, but my colleagues tell me they all had a great time when they came here. And I've given this lecture a lot. As I get older and older and probably retire sometime in the next few years, I find myself forgetting things, so I write it all down to make sure I don't forget it. And each lecture is different. So how many medical students do we have here? Some? Okay, we have a few. All right. So it changes. I thought I was going to be talking to engineers. So this is not, this is a fun talk. I give this to my fellows when they first arrive. We have a real big teaching center, and we want them to understand and appreciate the history of how we got to where we are today. And our story is part and parcel of all of that. And it's really fascinating. It's a human interest story, and I'm a trivia buff and history buff, so I weave all sorts of things in here to keep you from falling asleep and also to keep you off your cell phones while we're lecturing. So you'll see some funny things in here, but it's really designed to make you laugh a little bit, but also to be a little inspirational, because I met Julio in 1985, and I was blown away by his honesty, his sincerity, his humility, and his intelligence, and the work he had done so quietly without any recognition at all. And he had no intention of pursuing his inventions. In fact, he never filed a patent. And when I met him, I thought that was a little strange. But we shook hands that day, and that sliding door moment for me, as you'll see, changed my life forever and set into motion a series of events that really changed the world. And if I hadn't met him that day, I would not be here today. And cardiology would not be what it is today. So with that background, we'll talk a little bit about how we got here. So this amazing movie, if you haven't seen it, it talks about how fate intervenes in our life when you least expect it, and your life can go in any strange direction based on the slightest fickle hand of fate. And that's really our story. In fact, everybody in this room, it's your story too, because there are things that affect you in ways that you don't even understand that makes you go that way, makes your life go that way. So it's a series of doors. And I always tell my fellows, if you sit in your room all day, there's only one door in and out, you're not going to get very far. You got to get out in the world, see a lot of doors, because they're going to open and close. And if they open, make sure you go through them, because you never know what'll happen. So my son sent me a text last night on the way to in the airplane. He goes, "Dad, Bloomberg has stents." And I go, "Oh, well, he looks like he should get stents." And there's Bernie. And so if you're in a room of 1,000 people and you just ask, has anybody in the room have a stent themselves, or do you know somebody who has a stent? Everybody's hand goes up. Everybody knows somebody, all right? So how do we get here from there? From how it started. Here it is in 1986. I remember I met Julio in 1985. And once we filed our patents, we could talk about it. And then my job was to try and figure out what to do with it. We had no money, and we had a lot of plans. We had done quite a lot of animal work, eight years of animal work. But we needed more money, and we needed to pitch it, right? So what did I know? This is the world of before computers and cell phones, right? So I'm on the phone, on a rotary phone, calling all these companies, and all I got was, what? It'll never work. These were all the big players back then in the cardiovascular space, and everybody we talked to, they said, this is absolutely stupid, crazy, it's not going to work. So nothing but bad news. And here's why. Stents will clot, they'll get infected, edge dissections, restenosis, rupture, erosion, aneurysms. These are all the reasons why it can't work. But we had seen tons of data in animals, in different kinds of animals, and I was pretty certain these things weren't going to happen, but we didn't have human models. So these people, risk averse, all these great companies, billions of dollars of R&D, and they said, well, it's never going to work. So I would go back to Julio every time I'd make a trip. It's all right, nobody's interested. So then once I started talking about it worldwide, a guy actually stood up in this meeting in the European Society of Cardiology, stopped my lecture and said, you should be ashamed of yourself. It's unethical to put metal in human coronaries. And the crowd was booing. And then the next were going to be the apples and the eggs thrown. I said, all right, I better get off the stage. But I was undeterred. I went back and told Julio, well, they're not buying it. And he said, what are we going to do? I said, I don't know, but we'll figure it out. And we said, there's a way. I'm absolutely convinced that this is going to work. He wasn't so convinced, but I was. And then it got worse. In European Society of Cardiology, there's no future for stents. And then all these companies I told you about said, no thanks, it won't work. Here's ACS, which became one of our biggest competitors once they copied us. And then a little known fact is that when we did file our patents, we tried to give them away for free, and nobody would take them. So we offered them to the University of Texas, where all the work was done, to the VA, because some of the work was done in the VA hospital. And they said, no, 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 no. And so we just said, we'll do it on our own. So we ended up doing it on our own. Eventually we meet Johnson & Johnson. Boston Scientific was the only company that was interested, but they were broke. They didn't have any money. J&J liked it, though, and they should get a lot of credit for the vision, because this was a space they weren't in, and they really didn't understand it, but they were really, really interested. So and how I met them is a sliding door moment, because that never should have happened either. So how did all this happen? All that bad news to become one of the top 10 medical inventions of this century. We were in this magazine a couple times, IP Worldwide, 10 patents that changed the world. We eliminated bypass surgery. Pink is the number of bypasses, are almost eliminated. In fact, there are so few bypasses being done that teaching programs are having trouble teaching their fellows how to do it, because they don't see enough cases. So a fellow will go through 5 or 6 or 7 years of thoracic training and not see enough bypasses to actually know how to do them. So when they come out, they have to be proctored and taught. Just that's what the stent has done. It's eliminated bypass surgery almost, not entirely, but almost. And at our place, it just almost never happens. You'd have to be pretty sick to get a bypass. On the other hand, stents have gone up like crazy. So when we showed it to J&J, I always liked this slide because this guy, first day I met him, he says, wow, Richard, the body is a series of tubes waiting to be stented. I said, you are right. I said, we can put a stent anywhere. And in fact, I said that in 1985, 86, and it's come true. So everybody gets stents. If it's in your carotids, your renals, your liver, pediatric cases, children, newborns get stents. And if you put a valve inside of it, they get your valve replaced. If you put a graft on it, you get your aortic aneurysm replaced. And it all comes down to Julio's amazing invention. So the best example for you, the clinical people here, and in the news you'll see almost every few years a paper comes out and says stents don't work. And the press gets a hold of it, and then my phone rings off the hook. Another paper came out, the ischemia trial, and all my golfing buddies are calling me and they go, hey Richard, you see this? Stents don't work, ha ha ha. It happens all the time, okay? The ischemia trial, the orbit trial, the courage trial, and you know, the press just doesn't get it, right? So what they don't understand is that these are very selected cases, and when they say it doesn't work, what they fail to realize is that medicines don't work either, because half the patients in the medically controlled group fail and they end up with stents, and the stents rescue that group. But they ignore the real important things where it clearly works. And the best example that I can show you is for STEMI, which is the ST elevation MI, a heart attack, right? So in 1973, when I was a medical student, the mortality from a heart attack was 20 to 30%. So if you had a heart attack, that means total occlusion of your vessel, for you engineers and out there. Total occlusion, no blood flow. It's like cutting the fuel line to your car where you're driving 100 miles an hour. The engine dies, the car dies, right? Well, the mortality back then was 20 to 30%. And what did you do? Nothing. You were in the hospital for 4 to 8 weeks. You were on a little bit of medicine if you ended up in heart failure, and it was forbidden to do angiograms. So you would never get an angiogram. It was considered too dangerous. 1973. Compare that today. Fast forward now, the in-hospital mortality is 3 to 5%, 0 in some types of benign, easy, smaller heart attacks. 1 to 2 days in the hospital, ton of medicine. You're taken to the lab immediately, and we're on the clock, by the way. We get a report card that we see every month, door to balloon time. It's a national registry, so we get a report card. And if you're out of that zone, you hear about it. And why? Because time is muscle. And the quicker you open the patient up, the better. So we used to do that with the balloon, but guess what? It didn't work really good. The balloon would collapse, 10%, 15% would collapse, especially with all that clot there, they'd embolize, and they would infarct anyway. What the stent did, it turned a bad procedure into a perfect procedure every time. So that means that if you can get the stent there, no matter how bad your balloon result looks, it came out perfect every time. So that was the real thing, and when I hear these things that stents don't work, it's like, okay, of course they work. And the numbers are there to prove it. Let me give you an example. It's a 39-year-old male who came in with a STEMI in our hospital about 2 or 3 years ago. And if you look closely, his LED is gone, right here, totally occluded. That's what a heart attack looks like. And here it is after the stent's placed, completely restored. And this was within an hour or so. But that's not what made this guy interesting. What made him interesting was that he had a totally occluded right coronary at the age of 39, which we fixed, totally reconstructed. And he had a total circ occlusion and a total ramus occlusion, all of which were restored. Okay, you can't even tell that this guy had a problem, right? His ejection fraction jumped right back up. He ended up in the 40s or high 40s, low 50s. And he's actually years out now and he's doing great. That's impossible without stents. The balloon alone could never, ever, ever do this. So some secrets nobody knew. Julio never patented a stent because he had no commercial interest at all. This was a science project for him. And he was offended by the idea that you should actually make any money or commercialize this. He had no interest in it. And in fact, he made a presentation at the RSNA November 7th, 1984. And why that is important is that if you make a public disclosure before you file your patents, you lose all your international rights, and then you have 1 year to file your patent in the US, or else it becomes public domain, which means it is now worth nothing. So keep an eye on those dates. He makes the presentation on November 7th in 1984. I made him in May, and I found this out. I go, we need to file these patents. So we did submit our patents on November 7th, 1985. So we made it right at the buzzer. Had we not done that, we would have lost everything and the world would be a different place. The other funny thing that happened was our experience with the FDA was totally psychotic. The FDA said, don't randomize your patients. We don't do randomized studies here. Hard to believe, but that's what they told us. And that really set us back and it really confused us. So we did something really funny, which I'll tell you about later, because we didn't understand that we thought we should do it. They actually forbid us to do a randomized trial. So years later, we did our own randomized trial without telling them, and they got really mad, and they stopped the whole program. So that was my fault, mea culpa. So along the way, we had a lot of problems. There were a lot of early complications when we opened it up to the multiple centers. We had trouble having the doctors follow the protocol. The learning curve was very difficult. Competition edged in by 1998. We had all these design changes, but J&J couldn't really do them. It was an engineering problem because we didn't have laser cutting. We were doing everything with EDM. We needed curves, and they couldn't do it until the lasers came out. Other companies beat us to that because we were stuck in the EDM world, and the newer companies copied what we did, but they used laser cutting. We couldn't get J&J to move fast enough to change things. Then the FDA was throwing us curveballs left and right. They say, do this, and then they say, do that. I said, well, that's not what you told us. I said, well, that's what we want you to do now. Okay. So we kept starting, stopping. At some point, J&J was really mad at us, me in particular, and they wanted to bail out because the results weren't very good in Europe. And then we got mad, and we wanted to get rid of them, and we fought like crazy. Eventually, we kissed and made up, but thankfully it worked out. But I'll tell you more about that. So what I learned is that new ideas are very hard to promote. Remember, I was just a hayseed from South Texas. Me and Julio were just a couple of ding-dongs just running around South Texas. You know, we had no idea. We're taking on the medical device industry, we're taking on the FDA and the entire world of cardiology, which was totally resistant to permanent implants in the heart. And so it was very, very hard to get people to buy into this. So it was just me and him against the world. Conflict of interest, obviously, when you own the technology, there's a real tendency to oversell, like, oh yeah, this stuff works great. You got to really watch it because the world is watching you, and if you fall on your face, they'll be the first ones to tell you that your product isn't very good. So I tried to take the opposite approach. I sort of under-promised and over-delivered. The patent law, we made all sorts of mistakes with our patents, and then expecting too much from industry was a surprise to me. I thought you ask them to do something, you get it done. No, it doesn't work that way. And controlling your investigators, you had investigators running wild. For instance, I say, okay, we're doing the coronaries, and a guy will take a stent and put it in somebody's leg. I said, what are you doing? I said, yeah, it looked great. It was just a great idea I had. I thought I'd throw it in the, okay, you can't do that. Or you put it in a vein graft. I said, okay, the protocol says native coronaries. Don't put it anywhere else. And then we get yelled at. You would think it's easy. You ask your buddies to do something, they don't want it. They do something else. The legal stuff is an hour lecture in its own. I learned a lot. I became a part-time lawyer, became very good at giving depositions. And then delays, nothing's on time. And then, you know, like I said, trying not to overpromise. So these are the things that I learned. Well, 1985 is an important year. These are icons in our field. Charlie Dotter started it all. He's the guy who came up with the idea of pushing a catheter down into your leg to push open a plaque. Andreas Gruncic saw that and said, let's put a balloon on the side, on the end of it. So you'll discover in your world like ours that everyone stands on the shoulders of the giants before you. And Charlie Dotter was the granddaddy. But look at that when he died, 1985. Then came Mason Sones, the guy who basically invented angiography, and he died in 1985. Melvin Judkins, angiography from the leg, the Judkins procedure, 1985. And of course, Andreas Gruncic, 1985. Everybody died in 1985. What a tragedy. And these are all of our great icons. He died in a plane crash, which is really tragic. So he was the real granddaddy because he's the one who came up with the balloon idea. Not an engineer, but he worked hand in hand with some engineers in Zurich, and he was able to create that first balloon. But isn't that something? They all died in 1985. And that's exactly when I met Julio. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but this, actually I should show you that. This is Gruncic kitchen table. So this was his engineering lab. And see the bottle of wine there? That's how he got through the night. So this was all the plastic. He had no idea about plastics. He just went to the guy across the street from the Zurich hospital there, and there was a building there, and there was a polymer chemist that he met, and he introduced him to the concept of PVC pipe, PVC tubing. He had no idea what that was. So he's not an engineer, he's just a smart guy. But he took the advice of this guy, and he used PVC, and he made his own balloons on the kitchen table. And believe it or not, he would build them, make them, sterilize them, and put them in patients, which is hard to believe. He made his first presentation at the American Heart Meeting in 1976. Somebody had the wisdom to take this picture. How they found this, I don't know. But this is a poster presentation that he did on his first animal studies, and it was really fascinating. Got no press at all. A couple things of interest, though. I was at this meeting. I was a young medical student, my first heart meeting I ever went to. I never saw him, but I thought that was kind of curious that I was there. And Julio Palmaz, though, the next year saw Gruncic's presentation at the American Heart Meeting, and that's what inspired him to come up with the idea. That became important in our litigation because that was his flash of genius. He could actually directly say that it was in 1977 when he first got this idea, and it was from Gruncic himself. So what are the engineering challenges for angioplasty? The balloon material has to expand without elongating or shortening. has to have a fixed expansion diameter. When you blow the balloon up, when you say 3 millimeters, it's got to be 3 millimeters, or else guess what? You kill the patient. You overdilate, it perforates, boom. We can handle everything. Perforations are a nightmare. I get about 1 every 5 years, and they are a nightmare because the blood gets into the pericardium. You have to stick a needle in their chest, take it all out, and if you don't do it fast, the patient dies in about 30 seconds. So perforation is not fun. Fixed expansion, you can't rupture. I've had balloons rupture. These are things that we take for granted now, but the old balloons ruptured all the time. The catheter shaft material itself had to be thin wall, but it can't kink. It has to be a dual lumen. How do you make it? Extrusion was just kind of coming along back then, so Grunczyk really gets credit for building these catheters himself without all these technologies. The coatings has to be slippery, can't be non-thrombant. You can't put something in a patient and it clots, right? So these are enormous challenges that even he couldn't figure out, so he needed some help. So he eventually does his first patient in September of 1977. Here's the actual angiogram, and thank goodness it went well. Before and the after picture right there. And if you're a pioneer and you're doing your first case, you really hope it goes well. Because let's say the incidence of complications is 1%. If it's your first patient, you're done. If it's your 100th patient, you're okay. So when you do that first patient, it's kind of nerve-wracking. I get that question all the time. Were you nervous when you did your first case? And I did think about it. I said, well, if this clots, we're done. This whole program is done. But it worked actually pretty well. And Grunczyk was a master technician. Even though he had a lot of, these are all a lot of the criticisms he had. He was unbelievably persuasive, but he was very humble. He had answers to everything. I won't go into them in the interest of time. So here are the 3 giants. Charles Dotter, who had the first idea of fixing blood vessels. Grunczyk, who said, let's put a balloon on it. And then Julio's idea of putting a stent on it. So these 3 guys really are the granddaddies of our business. My role gets a little exaggerated just because, you know, of the work we did, but it was really Julio who's the genius. And all I did, I just was like a cheerleader trying to navigate him and making sure that we got everything in the right direction. But these guys really get all the credit. You can't forget these 2 guys because they're other Russ Prize winners. John Simpson, who came up, he was a big competitor of Grunczyk, and he came up with the sliding wire. And Paul Yock, of course, many, many things. Who's probably the brightest light bulb in the group there. He's so humble, but he came up with the monorail catheter, intravascular ultrasound, a whole host of other things. So, but there's another guy you should know about. This guy's John Abele, who had a little engineering background. He was the president of Boston Scientific, and why he's interesting, this is more of the human interest story to keep you awake. But John became a very good friend of mine, and he befriended Grunczyk, and he's the one who introduced him to extrusion and how to mass produce his catheters. And he became a very good friend of Grunczyk, and he was influential in bringing Grunczyk to here. And I've known John since 1986, I think. And world's nicest man, very smart, understands business, he understands engineering, understands patients, understands doctors. But what I love about him, he's so humble. I found this out not too long ago about John, and this is a submarine. This is the USS Grunion, which I would encourage you to look this up tonight when you go home and look it up on YouTube. It was a Gatto-class submarine that was designed to sink freighters, and it was commissioned in 1942, and its first mission was to go out into the Aleutian Islands and sink Japanese freighters that were moving freight back and forth all over the Pacific. So it goes down on its first mission and sinks a couple of ships, but then they find the Japanese ships find them and they sink the submarine. Submarine goes down. Why is that important? Well, John's father was the commander of this ship. He had just graduated from Annapolis, and John's father shipped out, and John never saw him again. So that was 1942, and all souls lost, missing in action. They never found the submarine, right? So John becomes very successful, and about 7 or 8, 9 years ago, he decides, after he made about $1 billion with Boston Scientific, that he wants to find his father. So it's a great story. So he puts up a website about the USS Grunion, and he finds all of the people whose other parents were on the ship, and all the men were lost. And he said, I think I'm going to find my dad. So he hires the guy that found the Titanic. And they sweep the Pacific Ocean, and they're not having much luck. And all of a sudden, he gets an email from a Japanese guy named Yutaka Iwasaka. He goes, it is me. I have prayed for the repose of your father's soul. And this was a young Japanese guy whose hobby was tracking Japanese freighters from World War II. And when he saw the website, he said, I think I know where your father is. So he actually tells John the coordinates. They send the ship out there, and they actually find the Grunion. So there's a picture of it right there. And they confirmed that it was actually the Grunion. So it's an amazing story. That's a picture of John with his father right there. So I just love the story. And there's a full documentary on it. It's really worth watching. But John is an icon in our business, and I think this is a very poignant story about some of the cool people that I've met along the way. So in 1985, what was going on? Angioplasty was blowing and going. Grunsick came to America in 1980. He had done maybe 100 procedures in Europe, maybe more. It took ground first 1980 at Emory. He started doing cases. He did his first course in 81, and I was there at that course. And so it's just generating a lot of interest. But we kept having these nagging problems. Acute closure, about 10% of the patients, usually within 24 hours. Subacute closure didn't happen too much. But the restenosis rate was about half. So about half the patients were coming back. So 10% of your patients are crashing and burning at midnight. It was always at midnight. You always got called in and you never could sleep because the phone was always ringing. And it was always somebody crashing, and it was always at midnight. So you have to go running in there and trying to open it, and they end up with emergency bypass. So everybody hated you. Anesthesia hated you. The nurses hated you. Your wife hated you because the phone was ringing all the time. But we were still gung-ho, and the surgeon was saying, you guys are crazy. This procedure stinks. It really fails too much. And we couldn't do all the tough cases. These are easy cases we were doing. We couldn't do CTOs, chronic total occlusions, acute MIs, multiple vessel disease, vein grafts, bifurcations, calcium, lung lesions. We really couldn't. So they were doing easy cases, and we were failing left and right. So angioplasty started losing favor. And bypass was making a comeback. Surgeons were really aggressive, and the press was all over it. Angioplasty stinks. So something had to change. And what happened to change was Julio. Dr. Palmaz came on the scene. And here's what a surgeon said once: remodeling your artery with angioplasty is like remodeling your living room with dynamite. So, very important picture, 1985. Look at the date, September 8th, 1985. And important for many reasons. This is Dr. Grunsick. He was a real showman. He loved having pictures of everybody. That's him right there. Very dashing, swashbuckling guy. A lot of famous people in here from there. The least important guy is right here. That's me, with the sunglasses and the funny mustache. And I made this course. I went every year to his courses, and I was just mystified. Why this is important is that I had permission to talk to Grunsick about our project because we wanted him to be an investigator. So I had it all set up that right after this meeting in October, I was going to go visit with him, share all of our data, and get his imprimatur to make sure that he was a god, by the way. He was a real god. If he said it is, we do it, we do it. So it was really exciting for me because I get to meet the god himself. And the week I was supposed to see him is the week he died. So he died a couple of weeks later in a plane crash. And I never got to see him and present our data. And it really hit the world really, really hard because he was irreplaceable. Those were shoes that could never be filled. But his legacy carried on, thankfully, because eventually the stent became, resurrected the whole angioplasty business. So I always feel like we did our just duty to him. So there actually was a guy named Stent. Where does the name come from? This is a dentist from the 1800s who called his little implants stents, and we just stole the name for the device. Here's a very young and handsome Dr. Palmaz with the original iliac stent. And Julio will never tell you his story, but it's a fascinating story. He was born in La Plata, Argentina. His father was a bus driver, and he died of a heart attack at the age of about 50. So premature heart disease becomes important. Remember, it runs in families. And Julio was really hit by this. He was 12 years old. He later marries beautiful Amalia, and his father-in-law has heart disease. He ends up with a bypass in Buenos Aires by Favaloro himself, the world's greatest surgeon, and he dies on the table. Okay, so the two great men in his life died from vascular disease. I think it really inspired him for medicine. He ended up going to medical school in Argentina, and then he ends up in Martinez, VA. His first stent concept was 1978, but in San Francisco. He was in San Francisco, but then he moved to San Antonio. Built a lot of prototypes. Then I finally meet him in '85. So these dates are really interesting because talk about sliding doors. I was in San Francisco exactly when he was there. I was in San Antonio exactly when he was there. So my story is not nearly as interesting. I'm from New York. I spent a little time overseas at Oxford. I was all over the place. I met Julio in 1985, and when I saw him, I knew this was going to work. He didn't, but I did. So my interest was actually in ultrasound. So I was at Duke in the 70s, 73 to 77, but in 1976 I needed a research project. So coming from an engineering background, my dad was an engineer from Georgia Tech, by the way, I was really fascinated with ultrasound. And what you see here is the first two-dimensional echo machine. Look how big it was. And it was built by Joe Kislow and his group over there. Joe's a clinician, but there was a very big biomedical engineering school, still is, and they actually built the very first two-dimensional echo machine. And so I made that my project. So I spent the whole year working on it. It was fascinating. I loved it. And Joe was such a great mentor because he taught me all about clinical trials and how to write papers, and I actually paper with my buddies over there in 1976, my very first paper in circulation. I was just a medical student. So I talk about sliding doors. How I met Joe was really, really interesting, fateful, but he was really good to me, and he kind of launched my career, and I can kind of track everything back to those early days. So the other funny thing that happened to me was from there I went to San Francisco, and my chief of cardiology calls me in, or medicine, he goes, "What are you doing, Schatz? What rotation are you on?" I go, "CCU, sir. I was in the Army." So he goes, "All right, I'm giving you 2 days off. The Army Nurse Corps needs you to go out in a sailboat and take pictures with all the nurses." I said, "Really? All right." "The other guys won't mind, huh?" He says, "No, that's right. I got you covered." So anyway, it was really funny. But what was curious about this was that the guy taking the pictures took a liking to me, and he says, you want to do some more of this stuff?" I said, "What?" He says, "Modeling." He says, "No, I'm not going to do that." He says, "Do you smoke cigarettes?" I said, "No." So he gives me a cigarette. "Here, take a cigarette and put it in your mouth and just smoke it." So I smoke, he takes some pictures. And then, so he calls me back and he goes, "Hey, I got a client, and you got the job if you want it. Can you come out to Kentucky for a couple of weeks and just take some pictures?" I said, "What for?" So they were looking for a new Marlboro man back then. So I said, "All right, that'd be great." And I thought about it. I said, "I don't know if I really want to be seen smoking cigarettes." So I didn't do it. Talk about a sliding door that I didn't go through, but I thought it'd be kind of funny because, think about trying to sell cigarettes, killing people with heart attacks, then come up with a stent and then try and fix everybody. I said, I wish I had some pictures that showed me. Anyway, it was kind of a funny story. So from there, I ended up in San Antonio, Texas, and this pretty lady is my wife, Renee, and then that's Joe Murgo, who's an electrical engineer, by the way. So electrical engineers either end up in patent law or in cardiology. So he was a brilliant guy. But why I show this slide is that when I went to San Antonio for my fellowship, he was going to ship me back to San Francisco in 1982. After I finished, I just got married, and my wife was in dental school. So I said, "Oh, you can't send me back, can't split us up. You're going, don't argue with me." So I fought like crazy for him. Why is that important? Because if I had done that, then I never would have met Julio. So because I stayed in San Antonio, I got to meet him. So I always have to thank Joe for that sliding door moment as well. So the other thing I did when I was there, and why it's important, because this is how I met Julio, was there was a baboon colony down the road in San Antonio. They had this colony of 30 baboons. Why is that important? Well, I was looking for a research project. I was a little bored. Remember, I started at Duke. I liked clinical trials, and I wanted to learn stuff. So angioplasty was coming along, and we were working on lasers to try and lase lesions so they wouldn't collapse all the time, right? So I find out that there is a colony of baboons there that have been on high cholesterol diets for 10 years, and they're even smoking. They had them smoking and eating all sorts of bad things to get their cholesterols. So I check them out, and their cholesterols are 10,000, 15,000. I said, "Here's an animal model for atherosclerosis." So I got a deal where I went over there and I calved all the animals. They had a calf lab, and calved all these baboons, and they're all normal. So after about a year, I said, they're all normal. So I'm tinkering around trying to create plaques. Well, the guy there says, "You ought to meet Palmaz. He's asking about you because he heard that I was doing this work." And I said, "Who is he?" So I said, "Okay." That's how I met him. So again, sliding door moment. So he introduced me to Julio, and the rest is history. So we get going and we start. I love the guy. I just fall in love with Julio. He's just so smart. There are a lot of things in common. We're both Italian. I know my name doesn't show up, but I'm Italian, and Julio's Italian. And we're both research type of people, kind of lab rats. So we get along really good. So we're doing a lot of these cases, but we run out of money. So we got hundreds of animals set up to do. We have no money. So remember, we couldn't give anything away for free. So we need money. So who's this guy? So I'm on the golf course one day, talking about sliding doors, and my friend says, "Oh, you should meet Phil." I go, "Well, okay." So I meet Phil. And he's a real funny Italian guy and multi-millionaire guy from San Antonio. So I meet him, and we take a liking to each other, and he invites me to dinner. So I go to the restaurant for dinner, and we just start chatting. I tell him the whole story. He loves the story about me and Julio. He never went to college, this guy, but he's the smartest guy I know. So he says, "I want to get involved. What do you need anything?" I go, "I don't know." So my wife goes, "Tell him you need some money." So I go, yeah, we're kind of out of money. He says, "How much you need? 10 million, 20 million? How much money you need? How much money?" I said, "Not that much." So I go, "I don't know, $200,000 or $300,000. He says, "Hey, come by the office tomorrow. I'll give you a check tomorrow." "Sounds great. Let's do it." So who is Phil? Phil is the most interesting guy you'll ever meet. And he's the guy who started Fuddruckers Hamburgers. Now, you may not have those up here, but they're real big in Texas. So he's a hamburger guy. So this is really funny. Me smoking cigarettes, Phil selling hamburgers. So let's give everybody heart attacks, and we'll give them stents and fix them all. So anyway, that's Phil. But also he started Romano's Macaroni Grill. I don't know if you have those up here, but that's Phil Romano, same guy. So he became a very good friend. He was there when my son was born. Keep the date in mind, May 16th. 1987. And he just insisted on being the godfather to little Brian. So that's Julio's wife, Amalia, who was the brains of the operation. And she was inspirational for all of us and also probably the smartest one in the group. She had the business sense. So she's the one who really kept the company going. And she ran her father's mining company out of South America. So she knew exactly what she was doing. So the funny thing about all this is there is a movie planned. So they're telling they're going to do some strange, they want to do a movie about this. So we started looking about all the people that we could use to play us. So we'll find out. So why in 1985? So in engineering thing, right? So you don't know this valve, it had a short life because it failed. This is an aortic valve called the Bjork-Schiley convexo-concave valve. And these struts right here, metal struts, can anybody figure out what's going to happen to this? These are it's a poppet that keeps opening, closing, opening, closing, opening, closing. Okay, they didn't know much about metal fatigue back then, all right? This is how we learned about metal fatigue. So these little struts here with all the banging weren't tested properly, but the FDA approved this. And you can see on x-ray, that's fractured. So this is what the fracture mechanics stuff really started with the FDA. So what happened was these things would fracture, the poppet would fly off and embolize into the brain or the aorta or somebody, but the valve was left incompetent. So patients were dying left and right after about a year or two having these things in. Pfizer was the company, they settled the largest lawsuit in the history, over $1 billion back then, a lot of money. So the guy who approved this also was the guy that I had to talk to about putting stents in the heart. So he was really excited about more metal in the heart. All right, so we weren't the first, so I always give credit to Julio for his brilliant work, but he was inspired by other people. There were other people before us who had the idea of metal in the vessels, not the heart. But if you look in the literature, you will find all sorts of springs everywhere. Everywhere in animals. They did a lot of work. This is an aneurysm repair. This is a Gianturco spring. So people had the idea, but Julio knew this, but he said, it's got to be balloon expandable because you can't just let a spring open up. So that's really the flash of genius, which allowed him to do this, the very first balloon expandable stent, this long piece of metal that he just wrapped around a pencil, and then he would solder each little spot. He said it took him 14 hours to do it. So he would build it, cool it down, and then he'd crush it on a balloon, sterilize it, and put it in the animals, right? And so the challenges for stents that he could see was, one, that he felt it had to be plastically deformable, so he had to get the right kind of metal. 316L turned out to be the best. Elastic modulus had to be just right. It can't be too springy. You can't open it, it can't close again, right? So we actually had to anneal the metal to make sure it just didn't spring back. Had to be smooth. How do you make it smooth? Well, chemically you can do that. Had to be non-thrombogenic. Can't be attracting clot. How do you do that? So we need a high expansion ratio. It's got to be really small to get there, then really big, right? So 4 or 5 to 1 expansion ratio. It's got to fit on a balloon. Well, balloons aren't made for this. So somehow you got to figure out how to get it doesn't do any good to put a stent, have the stent come flying off. So we take this for granted now, but it was not so easy back then. It has to be flexible. It's got to be deliverable. You can't snag on the vessels. It's got to be biologically compatible. It can't be toxic. All these metals have all sorts of impurities in them, right? You know, all that cobalt and chromium and all these other things that are in there which could be toxic. We didn't really know if that was going to be a problem. So here's us in the early days in the lab. That's me and him. I don't know why we took these pictures. We thought somebody would be interested someday. And here's the very first animal that he did. He took an animal. He wanted to see if a stent could resist recoil, because that's the fundamental principle of a stent, is to keep things open, right? So he took a dog and he wrapped a rubber band around the abdominal aorta, then came back about 6 or 8 weeks later, put a stent inside to prove that you could overcome the stretch of the rubber band and then it would stay. He has totally assumed the thing would crush or it would clot. Well, it didn't. The animal did great, and at 6 months, wide open. And then when we looked inside, there's the rubber band still there. You look inside, all endothelium. Says, wow, things integrated into the tissue. How about that? And this is all endothelial cells. So from there, he went from that design to this design, which is the official Palmaz stent. This is the repetitive slotted tubes, as they say, not flexible, 30 millimeters in length, and put it everywhere. We had to crimp it with our fingers, roll it, because the balloons weren't made for that. And he put them everywhere. He did a lot of work before I met him, but he made the first portacaval shunts. Talk about ahead of his time. This is where you punch across the liver and connect the hepatic vein to the IVC for patients who have cirrhosis. Unbelievable. He did a whole series of animals and published it. We did aneurysms. We created aneurysms in animals to prove you could externalize them, right? So create an aneurysm, and then you can put if you look close, you'll see a stent up here in this PTFE graft, and the aneurysm is outside. We just cured aneurysms, okay? We filed patents for this as well. Did a ton of work. I don't have time to show you everything, but I had done a lot of pediatric stuff. I was a pediatric cardiology fellow as well. I did a lot of babies, and I knew that there was a real role for children, for all the issues, clinical problems that kids get. So I had this idea, and here's what the stent looked like. So I showed it to my buddy Chuck Mullins, who was the preeminent pediatric cardiologist in the world, and he freaked out. He said, "This is great." We didn't have time for it. I said, "You take all the pediatric stuff." There's Chuck, and he built the entire, the whole world of pediatric cardiology changed on the basis of this one slide that I showed him. He actually did the cases with us, so he went on and did great things for children. So the other interesting thing is when I had this idea, if I could make a stent that big, I could just put an aortic valve inside of it, and then we could balloon and deliver a valve to the aortic valve. It was called, we didn't have a name for it, but I showed it to J&J. This is an example of you have a great idea, but you don't know what to do with it. And we were so consumed with our other work, I never filed a patent. So one of my few regrets in the world, I never filed a patent for this. And then, of course, 20 years later, somebody came up with the idea, or 15 years later, and this became mainstream. So now this is a $10 billion business. So I wish I had filed the patent. So if you have an idea, even if you think it's dumb, file the patent. And this is, I show this, I usually don't show this, but we asked the engineers, how do we get a stent to stay on the balloon? So they came up with this. We called it the jaws of life. So we just slide the stent and then just crush it, and it worked really good. So another engineers to the rescue. So we did our very first patient, iliac stent, on May 16th. That's Brian's birthday. Remember I told you that date? So that's why I couldn't be there, because my son was born that day. This was done in Germany, and you see the before and after down here. There's a tight lesion there and after. Worked out really good. And so the age of stenting began. So the iliac stent had its own life. That got approved by the FDA around 91 or so. But this was, we knew we had to get in the coronary. So this is the very first Palmaz-Schatz, well, it was a Palmaz stent. Anything with an articulation is a Palmaz-Schatz stent. So this is a rigid stent. It's a coronary stent, 1.5 millimeters in diameter. It's not very big, but it would get to 4 or 5 millimeters, so it's pretty cool. Here's the very first animal ever done. Here's the first stent right there, baseline, 6 months, and then 13 months. So they all stayed open. It was amazing. And we spent a lot of time doing all the histology. We want to make sure we understood what happened. So we were able, if you read all my original papers, we talk about what's happening at a microscopic level to prove it's biocompatible. And there was no doubt we were on the right track. We knew exactly what happened, first fibrin, then platelets, then clot, and then smooth muscle cells, then acellular ground substance. So one thing that happened that was interesting, when we were measuring the thickness of the growth inside the stents, look at the timelines, 1, 3, 8, and 32 weeks. So we'd look at angiograms at 1 week and say, they look great, Julio. 3 weeks, they look great, Julio. I was doing all the angiograms. And then all of a sudden at 8 weeks, I go, whoa, they're starting to close off. And all of a sudden, I remember going home, and I call him, I say, Julio, you're not going to believe this, but the stents are all closing. He goes, oh, Dios mío, I knew it was going to happen. I said, oh, the dogs are okay. I think it's going to be all right. But let's just wait and see what happens. So we did all the 8-week angiograms, and it's, oh my gosh, it's doubling and tripling. So tissue's growing, growing, growing. The animals did great. Then we finally came back at 32 weeks, and it all was gone. And so it turns out, when you look under the microscope, this is an absolute classic healing response. It's like a scar. So you get all the smooth muscle cells, the cellular material gets in there, gets kind of angry, but then it all goes away. And it's replaced by just a simple scar. So acellular, lots of cells here. So all the stents look fantastic. So what a miracle. Who would have known, right? Who would have known? And we looked under electron microscopy. We wanted to know what was happening at side points and branches. And here's endothelial cells to prove they're normal. The biggest thing for me, though, was the worst fear is to have one of these clot, because it's fatal. It could be fatal, you know, if clots, because it's always going to be in the midnight. So we did this really exhaustive study. Didn't get much play or press, but we did a randomized trial on over 30 animals to try and figure out what the best regimen is. So we take this for granted today. I haven't had a stent clot in probably 10 years. You take it for granted, but back then we didn't know. And I had to come up with the cocktail. So what was it? Antiplatelets, antithrombins, do we use Coumadin? Should we just use high-dose antiplatelets? I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing after we did this study. This is a stent if you don't use any antiplatelets at all, or heparin or nothing. They obviously clot. If you do aspirin, persantine, and heparin, you get this. But if you add dextran, you get this. And you can measure this. You can quantify this with indium-111 platelet labeling. And when you label these had lots and lots of indium. These had none. These had some. So dextran was the clue. Everyone always asked me, why did you use dextran? Because I didn't want this to clot. And it worked beautifully. So we don't get a lot of credit for this, and to this day I would probably still use dextran. It's amazing. But that's a little example of the extremes that we went to make sure that this was safe. So the last thing we had to figure out was these are all normal coronaries, so how do you test it? How do you dare go to humans if you don't know what you're doing with humans? So what we did is we took, this is an amazing thing, we did xenografts. So we took human coronaries and we put them in animals. So we take a dog and we take their femoral artery and resect it, and then take a human coronary and put it in between, just sew it end to end. So now we have a human coronary in an animal. So then we would stent them. And this is a very famous picture that shows up in all the textbooks. And this is showing the stents tacking up all the plaque. And this is what happens if you don't put a stent in there. This has been ballooned. It just cracks and it just collapses. Of course, a lot of plaque there. But if you tack it all up, it's supposed to look like that. So we did that. Nobody wonder where we get the coronaries? So you can't do this nowadays. We did some really strange things. So when we had an experiment, we would go down to the operating room. I would ask one of my cardiac guys if they were going to do bypass. I would just walk in and I'd go, can we have some of the coronaries, just peel off some of the patient's coronaries, give them to them. So tissue harvesting, they said, what are you going to do? He says, don't worry about it, just give me the coronary. So like if they had a bad graft that was occluded, they would just give it to us, or they would actually resect part of the right coronary or something and sew it off, and or just tie it off and press on. So that's how we got our coronaries. You could never do that today. You know, that's insane. We should be in jail for all the stuff we did. All right, engineering, right? So 316L, we could barely see it, so we experimented with other metals. Some of you experts here probably know what those metals are. They're radiopaque. So we tried tantalum, we tried gold. This is a tantalum stent. And while you could see them really good, they didn't have the right plastic properties, so we abandoned them over time. We went to the renals, we did everything. So when we were finally ready, we decided to do the first patient, December 1987. Me and Julio flew down there. And this is the team, and that's our very first patient. And that's afterwards, and here's his pre, post, and then 6 months later right there. And at 13 months, he was still open, which is amazing. Bare metal stent. And so our very, very first patient did very, very well. And unfortunately, he died in a car accident. Otherwise, he'd probably still be alive. Another case, second case ever did in the US. Here's the ugly right coronary. After the balloon, of course, comes out horrible. And when you stent it. So remember, a stent makes everything perfect. Not good, perfect. So you have a procedure now that's perfect every time, if you can deliver the stent. And so cardiologists were just celebrating like crazy. No more calls at midnight, no more abrupt closure. I can go finally sleep at night. I can do 10 cases a day. And they're not going to come back. And so we did have occasional deaths from other reasons. The patient died of brain cancer, so we looked at his coronaries, and it does exactly what we thought it was going to do. Here's a patient who died of a pulmonary embolus, but the stents are wide open. So by 1989, we were blowing and going. We thought we were doing great until what? We opened this up to multiple centers in Europe, and all of a sudden, all these complications started. So complaining, it was too rigid. The stents were falling off the balloons because the doctors weren't crimping them correctly. They were clotting. The clotting rate in Europe was a lot higher. Bleeding from the access site because the doctors weren't stopping the heparin. Restenosis was much higher than we thought. So this is where things started slipping and sliding, and JJ was getting a little nervous. And so I knew that we had to solve these problems. So the big thing for me was to make the stent more flexible. And why were things going poorly in Europe, I think, is because the doctors wouldn't follow the protocol. So I really learned that you really have to work really, really hard. But you know, cardiologists don't like to listen, and I used to yell at them all the time. Then I realized that I don't listen, because people come to me with their projects and devices, and my first reaction is, I don't know, I'm going to do it my way. So that's where we are. And so we had to work really hard on this, and it almost destroyed the whole protocol. I'm not going to go through this because it's a clinical issue, but eventually we figured out a way to get doctors to overdilate the stent. It's in the flow field, it's a piece of metal, you got to get it out of the flow field, so make it big. Angioplasty is the opposite with a balloon. Don't overdilate because you'll perforate. So it was really hard to talk doctors into pushing this thing really hard. And I'd see the films of stents that failed, and I look at it, and the stent looks like a dog bone. I said, how could you leave it like that? Well, I don't know, I didn't want to make it too big. I told you, you got to make it big. Anyway, it took us forever. But the guy named Colombo in Europe finally turned the tide by using ultrasound and using a new antiplatelet agent. So anyway, that's when things started getting better. All right. And then a surgeon said, why do you want a stent? A stent is like a time bomb waiting to explode in your chest. So if you find an older surgeon, mention my name, they get really mad. They really don't like me. Because a lot of those guys retired when the stent came out because they realized that they would never be able to catch up. So the younger guys kind of had to accept their fate. And what the younger guys started doing is just becoming a little more adept at other things. They became more creative. They started doing more creative procedures, and we've included them in all the TAVR procedures, by the way. So I didn't make a lot of friends. The older surgeons still don't like me. So for flexibility, I was at the airport one day, and I saw these little baggage carts just snaking around all the airplanes. And I thought, well, that's a good way that's all we have to do. Every place you look, you have these little box cars, right? So I came up with the idea, let's just have little stent pieces and put these little swirls in between so it's flexible, right? So we called this the slinky design, the spiral. That became the 417 patent. And here's, but what did I say before? J&J could only do EDM. So we couldn't do those swirls until lasers came around. So the best they could do is this, which is one little thing connecting it. So that became the Palmaz-Schatz stent. And this actually ended up as I was the sole inventor because this was my idea. I thought it was kind of silly. I said, that's not much of an idea. They said, well, it's an idea. It's flexibly connected, and Julio's original claims didn't talk about that. I said, well, put both our names on there. They said, you can't do that. It was your idea. So this was my first lesson in patent law. You got to be really careful, because if you put someone's name on a patent that doesn't belong there, it invalidates it, and you could lose all your rights to it. So you got to be really careful. So this is actually the patent in my name. It's also the 984 patent that was asserted in all the lawsuits. So we went to Europe to do our first case. Here's the very first patient. Here's a tight LED and post, and 6 months later, and it actually worked beautifully. It actually snaked through the catheter, and we got a great result. So if I were to tell you, since you're all smarter than me, all your engineers, said, we have a problem with the stent slipping off going into the coronary. How can you fix that? So we had this idea of putting a little subselective catheter down. So this is the first guideline, or another idea that I never patented. We use these all the time now. Someone else came up with the idea. But we used it back then. We made our own. And so we would put this little subselective catheter down to protect the stent from sliding off. And that's how we did that. All right. So finally, the first big randomized trial, 1993, the stress trial, randomized stents to balloons, and stents work. All of a sudden, restenosis rate was reduced by 30%. Benestent trial confirmed the same. FDA approves it. Here's our first packages, and pretty soon, by 1997, we're almost doing $1 billion in sales with that little device, which is really a pretty terrible device. So life was good. All of a sudden, J&J was happy now. They're finally making money. And now we have to get on to smarter things. So we used laser cutting. This is the crown. We called it the crown, a little more flexible than the velocity stent with little squiggles in between. So all this was designed for flexibility. And so the fun part is we were in the Inquirer a couple times. Nobody can say that. I've been in it twice. Here's one where they talk about the stent. They call it a steel spaghetti is what they called it. But then I traveled around a lot in the world, and this is one of my great trips to Kokura in Japan. You can see I look like Godzilla in there. I'm bigger than everybody. But it was a great trip. But it wasn't until I came back from there that I realized the importance of Kokura. Does anybody know what the importance of Kokura is? So any World War II fans will know that there were two bombs, right? It was Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 9th, right? Nagasaki was not the primary target. It was Kokura. No, very few people know that. And this plane took off from Tinia on the morning of August 9th with a 26-year-old pilot and a crew of about 8 guys out of Tinia, 1,500 miles to Japan. And their goal was to take out Nagasaki because there was a military plant there. So why this is so interesting from your perspective and mine is several things followed. As it took off, it took all the other weapons off to put more fuel on to make the trip, right? So as they took off, a fuel solenoid blew, and they lost about 1/3 of their fuel. And they couldn't use that engine. They couldn't use that tank. They already took off. They didn't want to go back. And halfway there, on the way to Nagasaki, the atom bomb armed itself and started ticking down to detonation. And nobody knew why. So they're panicking. They're calling everything. They call who? The engineers back at the base, right? And they made them take out all the circuit breakers, and they found that of all the 20, there were 2 that were put in upside down or something. So they made them put it back. And all of a sudden, the bomb stopped ticking. I thought that was really interesting. So they get to Nagasaki, and they realize there's a cloud cover, and the rules were you had to have visual. So they hovered for a while, looking at their fuel. We're not going to get out of here. So they went to Kokura because it was socked in, and they found cloud cover in Kokura. So all of a sudden, they got a crack in the cloud. Sweeney is looking at his fuel. We have no fuel. So they dropped the bomb anyway. They missed the target, by the way. And they come back home, and they landed in Okinawa with 7 gallons of fuel and 2 dead engines, and they nearly crashed. And Sweeney came under a heavy fire and was court-martialed. They tried to court-martial him because they thought he dropped the bomb without visual. I just thought it was a really interesting story. That's my dad. I don't have time to tell the story, but talk about sliding doors. He was in the Philippines waiting for the assault on Tokyo, so if the bomb didn't go off, maybe I wouldn't be here. All right, so there's some bad news also. Once the press got hold of some of this stuff, there was a little bad news out of Sweden. These guys said, you know, drug-coated stents aren't very good, and all of a sudden the press got hold of it, and all of a sudden we got all these horrible press, treatment traps to avoid, 10 overused tests and treatments, including stents, of course. In cold blood, doctors are killing you, don't get a stent. Tiny time bombs, they were called. Look at this, time bombs. But that's what happens. You know, the press gets hold of stuff and they go crazy. So there was this big backlash. Don't put stents in. Patients were calling me, can you take my stent out? I saw this article, and I don't want stents anymore. I want to bypass. You go, guys, you're crazy. This isn't true. So we went back, we did this big analysis. We found out there was no difference at all between the deaths. The paper was wrong. Actually, the guys came out, the guys who wrote the paper actually retracted it. They wrote another paper the next year saying, we're sorry, we got it all wrong. But it's amazing the power of the press, and patients read all this stuff. But you know, there was never an apology, and no one ever sat back and said, okay, that was a mistake. But these things happen, and it has profound implications. Who's this? Anybody good with trivia? All right, so in 1991, or 92, I get a call. I just got into work on a Monday, it was December, and my partner comes running in and says, guess who we stented this weekend? I said, I don't know. How would I know? I was on call, but I switched call with my partner. So he goes, Mother Teresa. I go, what? So I go, you're kidding me. So I called J&J, I go, hey, we got a problem here. And they go, what's the problem? I said, guess who we stented this weekend? And he goes, I don't know, who? I said, think big. So he goes, George Bush? I go, no, bigger. He goes, the Pope? I go, oh, you're close. He goes, no, come on, you're killing me. So I said, Mother Teresa needed a stent. She had a big heart attack. We put a stent in her. He goes, did you get a consent form? And I said, no. He goes, oh, crap. So he said, I'll call you back. So anyway, they were really totally aggravated with the whole thing. Like, I didn't do it, my partner did it. So anyway, it's a great story. It got even better when Julia Roberts came down insisting on seeing Mother Teresa. It ended up in the National Enquirer, and they talked about this. And of course, she had just done they called her the Happy Hooker, of course. She did the patron saint means the Happy Hooker. And then I became very good friends with her, and eventually we were asked to go to the Vatican for a beatification. I didn't go, so I sent this guy. I said, you're not going to get anywhere near the Pope. He sends this picture back. Hey, I saw the Pope. So through the years, I've been very lucky. I've had some great experience. This is the president and premier of Singapore, who got sick while I was passing through to Bali, and they asked me to stick around and fix him, so I did that. Jonas Salk got sick one day. We took care of him. King Hussein from Jordan. So this is a great story. You're too young to know who Boris Yeltsin was, but he had bad coronary disease, and my fellow was from Moscow. He had all these connections. He goes, hey, you want to do Yeltsin? I go, sure. So they send the films, and it was really bad disease. So I go, I don't know if we should do it. I guess we can do it. So it's all right, let's do it. So the government intervened, and they said, we're not having any Americans here. So he's going to have a bypass. So he ended up with a bypass. It would have always been nice if I had a chance to do him. Just one thing about the FDA, they're really our best friend now, but it wasn't like that. In 1993, they approved all these devices without a randomized trial, but they rejected our stent in 1993 because it wasn't randomized. Remember I told you they told us not to randomize? I talked about the whipsawing that we were getting. This is too painful a discussion, but they rejected this after all these years, but we did get approved in 1984. But by then, there was a lot of competition. These are all the devices, all the other people you should know about, other stents. Here's the MedInvent stent. This is Ginturco Rubin. Now, you're all engineers. You can think of solutions for flexibility, right? But this is a spring. This is a paper clip wrapped around a balloon. This is the AVE micro stent, which is two little swirls that are connected right in the middle there, right there. Okay, and then the Multilink, this is a real big one. Now, see with laser cutting, you get all these curves, and now you got a flexible stent. So these are all better than ours. So we had to admit that, okay, they're better than us for getting it there. But once we got it there, the results were the same. So the question is, how do you protect this, right? All these other stents came out, all this other technology. I'll skip this in the interest of time. We had all these patents, of course, and the clue here, I'll just show you the 984 patent here. So this is what J&J asserted. And we had all these lawsuits. You will discover that while you're poor, nobody really sues you for some strange reason. But if you're a failure, but if you're successful, boy, watch out. And I realized the only way to avoid a lawsuit is to never accomplish anything. So we had all these endless lawsuits for 25 years. And the lawyers were merciless. They introduced me as you'll meet the man who killed Mother Teresa. They said Palmaz and Schatz were greedy villains. They always try and poison the jury. Schatz knew the stents was dangerous. They said Dr. Palmaz was a Nazi. He's an Italian living in South America, come on, you know. And then the guy that gave us the hint about the 316L was a guy named Schultz, Werner Schultz from Martinez he was a retired engineer, but he was a Nazi, it turns out. He worked for Werner von Braun. And he emigrated to the US to work on our rocket program. And he was a Nazi, so the lawyers found all this out. So they said he was a Nazi sympathizer, anything to get the jury to hate you. Anyway, we don't have time to go through all the legal stuff, but why our patent actually survived the day was because the language. So what's unique about the stent, it's plastically deformable, consists of a plurality of members that are longitudinally displaced, a series of slots and half slots, very important, flexibly connected. And so the jury's all decided and agreed. And if you look at this picture of all of our competitors, here's ours in the middle. Okay, it's a series of slots and half slots that are flexibly connected. Well, that's what all the competitors are. They just rounded the edges. So believe it or not, $1 billion later, right? So J&J won all of everything. But the vindication and Julio's greatest moment really is this letter from Judge Robinson. The decades-long history of litigation, replete with ever evolving claim construction and theories of liability, will not be repeated here. It is time to give Dr. Palmaz his due and to bring this litigation to a close. So as a result of that, we beat them all, Abbott and Guidant and Boston and Medtronic, and they had to pony up $3.7 billion in penalties. So the greatest, one of the largest settlements at all for patent infringement, and that was all the 984 patents. So of course you know all about Julio. These are all the awards that he's won. There's my favorite, National Inventors Hall of Fame. Look at all the people on this list, and Julio's on there right there. This name, though, I only bring this up, even though we're out of time. I think it's so cute, such a story. I saw this name. I recognize everybody. Who's this? Now, I don't see enough white hair here. You might know this. So you know who she is? So this is her. She had this idea, frequency hopping, spread spectrum, allowed Allied torpedoes to escape axis jamming. She was not an engineer, okay? And it was used by the US Navy during the 1962 Cuban crisis, and it's used on most ships right now to actually jam other. And so if you look closely here, there's the name on this. So who is she? Hedy Lamarr. She was a Hollywood heartthrob actress from Hungary. Not an engineer, but she had this idea. I don't know, nobody can figure out how she came up with this. But anyway, most people don't know who she is except for Blazing Saddles, who they mocked her with Hedy Lamarr. That's who she is, okay? All right, the last thing I want to show you is our greatest accomplishment is the Russ Prize, of course. But I asked Julio, you know, the most important thing to him. He says, well, in the Smithsonian, we're in the Inventors Hall of Fame. So in there, you'll see the first Palmaz stent, but it's really the company we keep. On one side is the first cell phone, right next to us there. On the other side is Steve Jobs' first computer. So if you go to the Smithsonian, Julio is right in the middle of those two guys. And I think it's very fitting. I think he's one of the great minds of our century. So we did send him the Palmas-Schatz stent. They didn't find it interesting enough, so it didn't make it. So I said, well, I'm bummed, but Julio, I'll bet you never got into Playboy. So somewhere you'll see this. If you look closely, it's not in English. The best I could do was Slovenia. So that's my claim to fame. And here, of course, is the great Russ Prize. So in summary then, what's happened over the last some 30 years? Stents are here to stay. They're not going to go away. I think drug delivery will become more effective. People in this room are going to figure out how to do that better than we did it, right? The bioabsorbable stents are dead for now, but I think new ones are on the way. I met with, is he here? Who's that? Oh, there he is. Yeah. And he's got some ideas that I think are really great. So if that's what's going to take, somebody like you young people will figure out a way to make that work. All right? And then I think our final legacy is few medical devices or products have stood the test of time, been applied to more patients with such a profound impact. 100 million patients treated already on morbidity and mortality. Nothing has replaced them, nothing will, and really the engineers made it happen, not us. So what do you say, how do you end your career with that? Julio finally retired. He bought this beautiful vineyard, and he's retired up there. And this is me and him up at the vineyard. And we had a reunion, finally, all three of us, the three Texas amigos. We just met this year for the first time. We've been all together in about 15 or 20 years. And that's Phil. He's 80 years old now. And you should know, he has a stent and he has a stent. So Phil carries around in his phone his angiogram. And he's going to send it to me. I want to put it in the talk. But he said I liked it so much I decided to have one. So they both had little mini heart attacks and got stents. So I think I'm the only one who hasn't, but I'm younger. So I always leave this for all the fellows or young people that we talk about. Don't be afraid to dream. Don't ever let someone tell you it won't work. You guys are so smart. You should be able to come up with ideas like this every day. You're surrounded by great mentors and great attendings. Think of things that go wrong every day in the lab or when you're seeing patients or in the laboratory, whatever kind of lab it is. You should be able to come up with ideas. Don't be afraid to do that. And if you see a sliding door in front of you, go ahead and just go right through it. You never know what's on the other side. Thank you very much for your attention. Any questions? No, I guess not. Oh, there we go.
Obviously, I can see it's excellent, right? What about metal fatigue?
So, it doesn't happen in the coronaries because there's not a lot of motion. It's a really good question. So we got this all the time. And my response, but by the way, we did metal fatigue testing. The FDA did want us to do it. So we did the billion cycle tests, and the stents held up pretty good. So my response was, at least in the coronaries, because we basically put them in relatively straight vessels, right? So it doesn't matter if the metal fractures, in my opinion, because it's all invested. It's all covered with new intima. So who cares? So years later, when we got adventurous, we started putting long stents in the popliteal artery, where there's a lot of flexion. We'd see very high restenosis rates. And once the imaging got better and better, we could actually see that the stents were fracturing. And the stents that fractured had a higher restenosis rate. So my theory was wrong, that even though they're invested, there's some crumpling and crimpling that takes place, so that means more resistance, and then we saw more restenosis. So there's a move to, instead of using balloon expandable stents down there, to use the spring type stents. And there are a few on the market, but there's also some newer devices that are stronger. So it's a good question. We blew it off, successfully dodged that bullet with the FDA, but we were wrong. So it is a problem in the bigger vessels during flexion points. So you don't put them in the femoral artery, and you don't put them in the popliteal. If you're going to do that, just use springs, because they hold up better. Good question.
So what about polymeric materials? Are they strong enough to do it?
Nobody knows. So the only polymerics is really the BVS stents, which are the, I think, polyglycolic acid stents, the absorbable ones. So the answer is, if you make them thick enough, they're okay. So in the coronaries, you don't see fracturing, but they're so thick, they're hard to deliver. So when we met, we talked about thinness, making it deliverable, right? So you got to make it thin but strong. So my fear was always that the bioabsorbable ones would not be strong enough. But at 1 and 2 years, it's probably okay. Yeah. Another question? Somebody had a hand up. Oh.
Can you comment on the fatigue with relation to degradable metals?
The what?
The fatigue in relation to degradable metals.
Do you mean the magnesium stent? Right. So I saw the data on that when I was in Europe. I was at the European meetings last year, and they showed all the data on it. So I don't remember the mechanics of how long it's there. I think it's like 6 months to a year. I'm not sure, and you might know. But this is a stent that a Biotronic company makes. And the data actually looked pretty darn good, but the thrombosis rate is still high. And they'll clot as far out as 3, 4, 5 months. So it's got to be strong enough to withhold the vessel, because it will crush it. And over time, no one knows the exact answer. How long does it need to stay there? But there's something appealing about having it disappear. So I don't know the answer to that. I think it's too early to tell. Being used in Europe, and so we'll have to just see. But the thrombosis rate a little higher than I'd like to see.
For that, the hydrogen kind of generated from those stents, is that a concern?
Don't know. I don't know. I don't know enough about the mechanics about that. Okay. But
so for the metal stent, like is corrosion a problem?
Not a problem. It came up, it always came up, corrosion, but that's why the 316L was so good. 316L, the reason we picked it, L stands for low carbon, by the way, it had a huge track record with the FDA. So 316L steel was used for almost 80 years in patients. You know how? They used to wrap aneurysms with it. So they would open up the patient. The treatment for an aneurysm was not a bypass way back 80 years ago, 90 years ago. The guys are pretty smart. They'd take stainless steel wire, and they'd wrap the aneurysm. Just wrap like a baby. Wrap. And the FDA knew about this, and they had 10, 20, 30 years of experience with it, and it was, safe, doesn't corrode. So yeah, that's why we picked it. There's a 304L, mixtures of other.
The 316Ls sometimes have the pitting problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but this is invested. It disappears. It's behind the endothelium. Good question, and it came up, and believe me, we had to answer all that. We were satisfied. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.